At the prestigious Oceanview Grand Hotel charity gala, Eleanor Blackwood was arranging silent auction displays when she spotted a familiar figure across the crowded ballroom. What started as volunteer work took a devastating turn when she came face to face with the son who had abandoned her 15 years ago. Eleanor wasn't your typical charity volunteer. For decades, she had endured wealth, loss, and quiet dignity, known for her resilience after her husband's death left her in poverty. When she encountered Marcus's cruel revelation about a hidden trust fund, she had no idea she was walking into the most devastating betrayal of her life. What began as a simple charity gala would become a reckoning with family secrets that would shatter everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Blackwood adjusted the silent auction display for the third time, her weathered hands smoothing the auction sheet for the weekend getaway to Napa Valley, a prize worth more than she earned in 2 months at the bookstore. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once owned a vacation home in those very vineyards, back when James was alive and their world seemed unshakable. "Mrs. Blackwood, we need you in the kitchen," called Sarah, the event coordinator. "The caterers have questions about the dessert service timing." Eleanor nodded, her practical black dress, purchased from the thrift store, but still elegant enough for the Oceanview Grand Hotel, rustling as she moved through the glittering crowd. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala drew the coastal town's elite, and Eleanor had volunteered for these events for the past 5 years, finding purpose in the work even as she remained invisible to most attendees. The ballroom sparkled with crystal and gold, filled with people who once called her friend. Now they either didn't recognize the widow in volunteer clothing or chose not to acknowledge her reduced circumstances. Eleanor had made peace with both possibilities years ago. She was consulting with the head chef about the timing of the chocolate fountain when she saw him. Marcus stood near the bar, his custom-tailored tuxedo impeccable, a crystal tumbler of what she knew would be top-shelf scotch in his hand. Her son had inherited James's height and broad shoulders, but where her husband had carried himself with warmth, Marcus radiated cold authority. The years had been kind to him, his dark hair silvered at the temples, his face lean and sharp with success. Eleanor's breath caught. 15 years. 15 years since their last devastating argument. 15 years since he'd walked out of her life, choosing his father's money over his mother's love. She hadn't known he'd returned to town. Marcus was surrounded by admirers. Young tech entrepreneurs, local politicians, women in designer gowns hanging on his every word. Eleanor recognized the dynamic immediately. He'd built an empire, become someone important. The boy who'd once brought her dandelions from the garden was now a man who commanded rooms. She should slip away, return to the kitchen, focus on her volunteer duties, pretend she hadn't seen him. But something rooted her in place. Perhaps the same stubborn pride that had sustained her through a decade of poverty, or maybe just the desperate hope that time had softened whatever had broken between them. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Marcus's expression shifted. Surprise, then something colder. He excused himself from his admirers and began walking toward her with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped her clipboard. "Mother." His voice was low, controlled, designed not to carry to nearby conversations. "Marcus." She searched his face for some trace of the boy she'd raised, the child who'd climbed into her lap during thunderstorms. She found only glacial calculation. "Still playing the charity volunteer, I see." His gaze swept over her modest dress, her practical shoes, the volunteer badge pinned to her lapel. "How fitting." "It's meaningful work," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm helping coordinate tonight's. I know exactly what you're doing here." Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "The question is whether you know what I've been doing all these years." Something in his tone made Eleanor's stomach clench. "Marcus, I don't understand." "Don't you?" His smile was sharp as winter. "All these years, Mother, you've been playing the martyr. Poor Eleanor, left with nothing but debt when Daddy died. Poor Eleanor, working in bookstores and volunteering at charity events. Poor Eleanor, abandoned by her ungrateful son." The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor glanced around. grateful that the crowd's chatter masked their conversation. "Why are you saying this?" "Because I want you to know." Marcus's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction or pain. She could no longer tell the difference in him. "I want you to know that every day you've struggled, every night you've worried about paying rent, every time you've had to choose between groceries and medicine, I could have stopped it." Eleanor's world tilted. "What are you talking about?" "The trust fund, Mother. The $12 million Dad left specifically for you." Marcus watched her face with scientific interest. "The fund I've been controlling since his death. The money that's been earning interest all these years, while you've been living like a pauper." The clipboard slipped from Eleanor's nerveless fingers, clattering to the marble floor. Around them, the gala continued, laughter and music and the clink of champagne glasses. But Eleanor felt as if she were drowning. "That's impossible," she whispered. "James left debts, the lawyers said what I paid them to say." Marcus's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone revealing a long-held secret. "Thomas Whitmore was very cooperative once I explained the situation. Amazing how flexible legal interpretations become when properly incentivized." Eleanor's legs felt weak. She reached for the wall to steady herself, her mind reeling. 12 million. 12.3 actually. Good investments. Marcus straightened his cufflinks with deliberate calm. "I've been quite the responsible steward of your inheritance." "Why?" The word escaped as barely a breath. For just a moment, something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Old pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the boy who'd once loved her. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Because you chose him over me. Every day, every year of my childhood. His work, his success, his approval, that's all that mattered to you. So when he finally tried to buy your forgiveness with money, I decided you didn't deserve it." Eleanor felt the world spinning around her. The elegant ballroom, the glittering crowd, the life she built from the ashes of her old one, all of it suddenly felt like a cruel joke. She couldn't finish the sentence. She needed air, space, somewhere to process the magnitude of what he'd just revealed. Marcus finished his scotch and set the empty glass on a passing waiter's tray. "Enjoy the rest of the gala, Mother. I hear the silent auction is quite successful this year." He walked away without another word, rejoining his admirers as if nothing had happened. Eleanor stood frozen against the wall, watching her son laugh at something a blonde woman said, his smile genuine and warm for anyone who wasn't his mother. 20 minutes later, Maggie O'Sullivan found Eleanor in a service corridor, sobbing into her hands while catering staff moved efficiently around her. "Jesus, Ellie, what happened?" Maggie's strong arms wrapped around her friend, her voice fierce with protective anger. "Who did this to you?" Eleanor couldn't speak. How could she explain that her entire life, her poverty, her struggles, her quiet acceptance of a diminished existence, had been an elaborate cruelty orchestrated by her own son? Maggie helped her to the parking garage, settled her into the passenger seat of her old Honda, and drove them through the dark coastal streets, without asking questions. Eleanor stared out the window at the mansions dotting the hillside, wondering how many secrets they held, how many lives had been quietly destroyed by people who smiled and attended charity galas and looked like pillars of the community. Back in her small apartment, Eleanor sat on her worn sofa and stared at the wall until dawn. Maggie had offered to stay, but Eleanor needed solitude to process the earthquake that had just shattered her world. $12 million. $12 million that could have saved her from eviction notices, from choosing between heat and groceries, from the daily humiliation of counting pennies while surrounded by the wreckage of her former life. But more than the money, the betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. Marcus hadn't just stolen her inheritance. He'd stolen 15 years of her life, turning her grief into a cage and her love into a weapon against herself. As the sun rose over the Pacific, Eleanor Blackwood made a decision that would have been impossible just hours earlier. She would not accept this. She would not let her son's cruelty define the rest of her life. She would fight back. She had no idea how. No understanding of legal procedures or trust funds. or the weapons that wealth could deploy against truth. But for the first time in a decade, Eleanor felt something other than resigned acceptance flowing through her veins. She felt fury. And fury, she was beginning to remember, could be a powerful motivator. Marcus's hand might have held all the cards for 15 years, but the game wasn't over yet. The morning after the gala, Eleanor's fury had crystallized into something harder and more focused. She sat at her small kitchen table, nursing her second cup of coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like bitter necessity, and staring at the business card Maggie had pressed into her hand before leaving the night before. David Chen, Legal Aid Society. She read aloud, her voice hoarse from the tears she'd finally allowed herself to shed. The card was simple, printed on standard cardstock rather than the heavy cream paper she remembered from the lawyers who'd handled James's estate. Or rather, who'd pretended to handle it while orchestrating her financial destruction. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for her phone, an ancient flip model that embarrassed her when younger people saw it, but which was all she could afford. She'd put off making this call for 3 hours, paralyzed by the enormity of what she was contemplating. Fighting Marcus meant fighting someone with unlimited resources. Someone who'd had 15 years to perfect his deception. It meant admitting that her entire adult life had been built on a lie. But the alternative, accepting his cruelty, letting him win, felt like a kind of death. The phone rang twice before a warm voice answered. Legal Aid Society, David Chen speaking. Mr. Chen? Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. My name is Eleanor Blackwood. A friend gave me your card. I think I need help. An hour later, Eleanor stood outside a narrow storefront wedged between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant, questioning every decision that had led her here. The Legal Aid Society's office looked nothing like the marble and mahogany law firms she remembered from her previous life. Hand-lettered signs in Spanish and English covered the windows, advertising services for immigration, tenant rights, and family law. It looked exactly like what it was, a place where desperate people came when they had nowhere else to turn. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now one of those people. A bell chimed as she pushed open the door, stepping into a cramped waiting room filled with mismatched chairs and overflowing filing cabinets. The smell of coffee and photocopier toner hung in the air, mixed with something Eleanor recognized as the particular anxiety that came from people fighting battles they weren't sure they could win. Mrs. Blackwood? Eleanor turned to see a man in his mid-40s approaching from a hallway lined with offices barely large enough for desks. David Chen was shorter than she'd expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who worked too many hours for too little pay. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. Thank you for seeing me, Eleanor said, suddenly aware of her own appearance. The carefully mended sweater, the sensible shoes resoled twice, the handbag she'd carried for nearly a decade. Of course. Come on back to my office. David's office was exactly what Eleanor had expected. Law books held up by bookends made from bricks, a desk covered in case files, and a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. But the walls were covered with photos. Families, children, elderly couples, all smiling, all grateful. All people David Chen had helped. Coffee? He offered, gesturing to a machine that looked older than Eleanor's phone. Please. Eleanor settled into a chair that had seen better decades, clutching her purse in her lap like armor. David poured 2 cups and settled behind his desk, studying her with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to read between the lines of his clients' stories. Tell me what's happened. Eleanor had rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless hours before dawn, but now that the moment had arrived, the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain the casual cruelty of her son's revelation? How could she make the stranger understand the weight of 15 years of unnecessary struggle? My son, she began, then stopped, started again. Yesterday I learned that my son has been controlling a trust fund my late husband left for me. $12 million. For 10 years I've been living in poverty while he... She trailed off, the magnitude of it still too large to comprehend. David leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." So Eleanor did. She told him about James's sudden death, about the lawyers who'd explained with practiced sympathy that the debts exceeded the assets, about signing papers she'd been too grief-stricken to understand fully. She told him about selling the house, the cars, the jewelry, everything except her wedding ring, which she'd never been able to part with. She told him about the long slide from comfortable widow to struggling pensioner, about choosing between heating and groceries, about the slow erosion of dignity that came from counting every penny. And she told him about Marcus, about the brilliant boy who'd grown into a cold man, about the argument that had shattered their relationship, about 15 years of silence broken only by his casual cruelty at a charity gala. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Eleanor finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her with new intensity. "Mrs. Blackwood, what you're describing sounds like fraud on a massive scale. But I have to ask, do you have any documentation? Any papers from the original estate settlement?" Eleanor opened her purse and withdrew a manila folder, thin with age and handling. "Not much. I kept what they gave me, but I was told most of the documents were confidential due to the complexity of the debts." David opened the folder and spread the contents across his desk. Eleanor watched his face as he read, seeing his expression grow increasingly grim. He picked up one document, a settlement summary, and held it to the light, examining it closely. "This signature," he said slowly, "it doesn't look right. The ink is different from the rest of the document." Eleanor's heart began to race. "What does that mean?" "It means someone may have altered this after you signed it." David set the paper down carefully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I want to help you, but I need you to understand what we're up against. Your son has had years to cover his tracks, and he clearly has significant resources. This won't be easy, and there's no guarantee we'll win. But you think there's a chance?" David was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents again. When he looked up, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that she hadn't felt in years: hope. "More than a chance. If what you're telling me is true, if he's been systematically defrauding you for a decade." David's voice grew hard. "I've seen this before. Rich people who think they can rewrite reality to suit their convenience. They count on their victims being too poor, too scared, or too broken to fight back." "And you're willing to take the case, even though I can't pay you?" David smiled, and for the first time since the gala, Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. "Mrs. Blackwood, I didn't become a legal aid lawyer to get rich. I did it because everyone deserves justice, regardless of their bank account. Besides," his smile turned sharper, "I have a particular fondness for cases that let me go after entitled assholes who prey on their own families." Eleanor blinked at the profanity, then surprised herself by laughing. "I don't think anyone's ever called my son an asshole before." "Well, it sounds like it's overdue." David gathered the documents and stood. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to the courthouse to pull the original probate records. Then we're going to start building a timeline of exactly what happened to your husband's estate." "And Mrs. Blackwood?" "Yes. Call me David. We're going to be working together for a while." 2 hours later, Eleanor found herself in the basement records room of the county courthouse, surrounded by filing cabinets that held decades of human drama reduced to legal documents. David moved through the files with practiced efficiency, pulling folders and spreading them across a narrow table. "Here," he said, setting a thick file in front of Eleanor. "This is the original probate filing for your husband's estate." Eleanor opened the file with trembling hands. The first document made her gasp. It was an inventory of James's assets at the time of his death, listing holdings worth nearly $18 million. Far from the debt-ridden estate she'd been told about, James had died a wealthy man. "I don't understand," she whispered. "They told me there was nothing left after the debts." David pointed to a series of amendments filed months after the original inventory. "Look at the dates on these modifications. Someone systematically transferred assets out of the estate and into various trusts and corporate entities. And look here." He indicated a signature line. "Who's Thomas Whitmore?" "The estate attorney." He handled everything after James died. Eleanor's voice was hollow as the full scope of the deception became clear. Well, Mr. Whitmore and your son have some explaining to do. David's voice carried a satisfaction that made Eleanor look up sharply. You sound like you're looking forward to this. David's smile was predatory. Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor, I spent 10 years in corporate law making rich people richer. I left that world because I got tired of watching the powerful crush the powerless. This case? He gestured at the documents spread before them. This is exactly why I became a lawyer in the first place. As they drove back to Eleanor's apartment, the setting sun casting long shadows across the coastal town, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in a decade: the possibility of justice. More than that, she felt the beginning of trust in another human being, something she'd thought Marcus had killed in her forever. David, she said as he pulled up to her building, why are you really doing this? The truth. He was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the steering wheel. My ex-wife came from money. Old California wealth, the kind that shapes laws to protect itself. When we divorced, she used that wealth to keep me from my kids for 2 years. I fought her in court and won, but it nearly destroyed me financially. I learned what it feels like to be powerless against unlimited resources. Eleanor studied his profile in the dim light. And now you fight for people like us. People like us, he agreed. The ones they think don't matter. As Eleanor climbed the stairs to her apartment, she felt the weight of possibility settling around her like a new coat. For 15 years, she'd accepted her diminished circumstances as the natural order of things. But now, with David's help, she was beginning to understand that her poverty hadn't been inevitable, it had been imposed, and what had been imposed could be undone. Marcus had controlled her story for too long. Tomorrow they would begin writing a new ending. Eleanor's hand trembled as she turned the key in her apartment door. The weight of possibility that had settled around her during the drive home now felt heavier, more complex. Inside her small living room, she sank onto the worn sofa and stared at the documents David had photocopied for her. Evidence of the life that should have been hers. Proof that her decade of struggle had been orchestrated by the son she'd once loved more than her own breath. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by her window watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to gray light over the Pacific, thinking about James. Had he known? Had he suspected that Marcus might intercept his final gesture of love and provision? Or had he died believing that his careful plans would protect her? By the time David called at 8 a.m., Eleanor had already been dressed for an hour. I've been thinking about our next move. His voice carried the energy of someone who'd also spent a sleepless night planning. We need to confront Whitmore directly. Make him explain these discrepancies before he has time to coordinate his story with your son. Will he see us? He'll see us. David's tone carried a certainty that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Trust me. Thomas Whitmore's law office occupied the top floor of a glass building overlooking the harbor, the kind of prestigious address that spoke of successful clients and substantial fees. Eleanor remembered coming here once with James, years before his death, to update their wills. She'd thought Whitmore trustworthy then, a distinguished man with silver hair and expensive suits who'd handled the Blackwood family's legal affairs for decades. Now, as the elevator carried them toward his office, Eleanor felt only dread. The receptionist, a polished young woman who looked barely out of college, greeted them with professional warmth that flickered when David announced their purpose. Mr. Whitmore doesn't typically see clients without appointments, she said, her smile becoming strained. Tell him Eleanor Blackwood is here about her late husband's estate, David replied, his voice carrying an authority that made the receptionist's eyes widen slightly. Tell him it's urgent. 5 minutes later, they were ushered into Whitmore's corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the harbor. Thomas Whitmore stood behind his mahogany desk, and Eleanor was shocked by how much he'd aged. The distinguished attorney she remembered had become a nervous, pale man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the tremor in his hands. Eleanor, he said, attempting warmth but achieving only unease. What a surprise. I wasn't expecting. That is, I didn't know you were. He seemed to realize he was rambling and stopped abruptly. Hello, Thomas. Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. This is David Chen, my attorney. We have some questions about James's estate. Whitmore's face went a shade paler. Your attorney? I don't understand. The estate was settled years ago. Everything was handled according to what? David interrupted, setting his briefcase on the polished conference table and removing a stack of documents. Because these probate records show some very interesting discrepancies. Eleanor watched Whitmore's face as David spread the documents across the table. The attorney's reaction confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't confusion or surprise, but the panic of someone whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. I'm afraid I don't know what you're implying, Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. The estate was complex, with significant debts that $18 million in assets, David said flatly, pointing to the original inventory. That's what James Blackwood was worth when he died. Yet somehow, by the time the estate was settled, Mrs. Blackwood walked away with nothing but debt. How does that happen, Mr. Whitmore? Whitmore moved to his desk chair, sitting heavily. Eleanor noticed his hands were shaking more pronounced now. The debts were substantial. The tech industry is volatile, and James had made some risky investments that— Show us the documentation, Eleanor said, finding her voice. Show us the debts you claim ate up $18 million. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Whitmore's eyes darted between Eleanor and David, and she could almost see him calculating, weighing his options, considering his exposure, perhaps wondering how much they actually knew. I'll need to review the files, he said finally. The records are stored off-site, and it will take time to— Mr. Whitmore. David's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. We know about the trust fund. We know about the $12 million that Marcus has been controlling. What we want to know is how you helped him steal it. The words hit Whitmore like physical blows. His face crumpled, and for a moment Eleanor saw not the dignified attorney but a frightened old man who'd made terrible choices and was now facing their consequences. I didn't want to, he whispered, then seemed to catch himself. I don't know what you're talking about. The estate was handled properly according to all legal. Stop! Eleanor stood, her own voice surprising her with its authority. Thomas, I've known you for 20 years. I trusted you to honor my husband's wishes. And you betrayed that trust. The least you can do now is tell me the truth. Whitmore looked up at her, and for a moment, something human flickered in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or regret. But then his expression hardened, and Eleanor saw him retreat behind the walls of legal jargon and professional distance. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave, he said, reaching for his phone. If you have concerns about the estate settlement, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the state bar, but I won't be subjected to these baseless accusations. David gathered the documents with deliberate calm. We'll be filing more than a complaint, Mr. Whitmore. When we're done, you'll be looking at criminal fraud charges, disbarment, and personal liability for every penny you helped steal. As they waited for the elevator, Eleanor felt a mixture of satisfaction and dread. They'd confirmed their suspicions, but they'd also declared war on people with unlimited resources and no apparent scruples about how they used them. He'll call Marcus the moment we leave, she said. I'm counting on it, David replied. Panicked conspirators make mistakes. They were right. 20 minutes after Eleanor and David left his office, Thomas Whitmore's hands shook so badly he could barely dial Marcus's private number. The phone rang twice before Marcus's familiar voice answered, crisp and businesslike. Whitmore. This had better be important. Marcus, we have a problem. Whitmore's voice cracked. Your mother was just here. With a lawyer. They know about the trust fund. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Whitmore began to wonder if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried a cold fury that made the attorney's blood chill. What exactly do they know? Everything, I think. They have the original probate records, and they're asking about the asset transfers. Marcus, if they start digging deeper, they won't. Marcus's voice was flat, final. You're gonna make sure of that. I don't understand. How can I? Figure it out, Thomas. You're the lawyer. But understand this. If my mother succeeds in overturning the estate settlement, if she gets her hands on that money, you'll be the one who takes the fall. Fraud, malpractice, criminal conspiracy. I'll make sure every bit of blame lands on you. Whitmore felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. Marcus, please. I did what you asked, but I never intended. What you intended doesn't matter. What matters is what you do next. Marcus's voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to total control. Destroy any remaining documentation that connects me to the trust fund manipulation. And find a way to discredit whatever evidence they think they have. I can't destroy evidence in an active investigation. That's obstruction of justice. It's survival. Marcus cut him off. Because if you don't figure this out, I'll ensure that everyone knows this was your idea, your plan, your execution. I'll testify that you approached me with the scheme, that you convinced me my mother didn't deserve the money. Who do you think they'll believe? The grieving son trying to honor his father's wishes, or the corrupt lawyer who manipulated a family's tragedy for personal gain? The line went dead, leaving Whitmore staring at his phone in the gathering dusk of his corner office. Outside, the harbor lights were beginning to twinkle, reflecting off the dark water like scattered diamonds. Once, this view had represented success, respectability, the rewards of a life well lived. Now it felt like a prison. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse apartment, Marcus stood at his own wall of windows, looking out over the city he'd conquered through ambition and ruthless calculation. His reflections stared back at him, successful, powerful, untouchable. But beneath the surface, something was stirring that he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. His mother had always been too trusting, too willing to accept what she was told. The fact that she'd hired a lawyer, that she was actively investigating, meant she'd found something that had awakened the fighter he'd thought he'd successfully crushed 15 years ago. Marcus reached for his phone and dialed his head of security. I need a complete background check on David Chen, Legal Aid Society. I want to know everything: his cases, his clients, his weaknesses. And I want it by tomorrow morning. Quote. As he ended the call, Marcus caught his reflection again in the dark window. For just a moment, he saw not the successful businessman, but the angry boy, who'd felt abandoned by the parents who'd chosen their work over their son. The boy who'd decided that if love couldn't be earned, then at least respect could be commanded through fear. He'd spent 15 years teaching his mother that lesson. He wasn't about to let some small-town lawyer undo his work now. The war Eleanor had begun with her questions would escalate quickly. But Marcus had resources she couldn't imagine, and a willingness to use them that she'd never quite understood. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Sophia Reyes had worked for Marcus Blackwood for 3 years, and in that time she'd learned to read the subtle signs of his moods with the precision of a meteorologist tracking storm systems. The tight line of his jaw when a deal went sideways. The way his fingers drummed against his desk when he was calculating how to destroy a competitor. The cold stillness that settled over him when someone made the mistake of challenging his authority. But she'd never seen him like this. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying a venom that made Sophia's skin crawl even through the closed door. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was about to be destroyed, and Marcus was relishing the prospect. When he finally ended the call and turned back to his desk, his face carried an expression Sophia had only seen once before, when a former business partner had tried to expose some of Marcus's more questionable practices. That partner now worked as a night shift security guard, his reputation so thoroughly demolished that no respectable company would hire him. Sophia, Marcus's voice was deceptively calm. I need you to pull all the Blackwood family trust files. Everything. I want hard copies of every document, every transfer record, every communication. Sophia's stomach clenched. She'd helped manage those files for 2 years, had processed the quarterly statements and investment reports that showed millions of dollars generating returns while Marcus lived in luxury. She'd always assumed it was his inheritance, his father's way of ensuring his son's success. But there had been inconsistencies that nagged at her, references to beneficiary provisions that didn't match Marcus's spending patterns, quarterly reports addressed to someone else entirely, reports that Marcus always reviewed personally before filing away in his private safe. "Sir, are you sure you want hard copies? The digital security is much more." "Hard copies, Sophia. And then I want you to ensure all digital records are permanently archived. Server maintenance, if you understand my meaning." She understood perfectly. He wanted the electronic evidence destroyed. "Mr. Blackwood, if there's an ongoing legal matter, destroying records could constitute." Marcus's head snapped toward her, his eyes carrying a warning that made her blood freeze. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sophia?" "No, sir, of course not. I just want to make sure we're following proper procedures. The procedures I need you to follow are very simple. Gather the files, secure the digital records, and forget we had this conversation." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "You've always been so good at discretion. I trust that hasn't changed." Sophia nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. As she turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped her at the door. "Oh, and Sophia, cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. I have some family business to attend to." Alone in the outer office, Sophia's hands shook as she opened the secure filing system that contained the Blackwood family trust documents. Family business. In 3 years, she'd never heard Marcus mention any family. He lived like a man with no connections to anyone, no obligations beyond his own ambition. But as she pulled the files, pieces began forming a picture that made her stomach turn. The beneficiary listed on the original trust documents wasn't Marcus Blackwood. It was Eleanor Blackwood, spouse of James Blackwood, deceased. The quarterly statements she'd been filing away weren't summaries of Marcus's inheritance. They were reports on someone else's money that he'd been systematically stealing. With trembling fingers, Sophia accessed the digital records Marcus wanted destroyed. What she found there made her sink into her chair, her face pale with the magnitude of what she'd unknowingly helped facilitate. Emails between Marcus and someone named Thomas Whitmore discussing, quote, managing the widow's expectations and, quote, maintaining necessary legal fictions. Transfer authorizations that moved millions from the trust into Marcus's personal accounts. Ex-investment reports showing the trust fund growing, while its rightful beneficiary remained unaware of its existence. And then she found the surveillance reports. Marcus had been having his own mother watched for years. Private investigators tracking Eleanor Blackwood's daily routine, her financial struggles, her volunteer work. Reports detailing every humiliation, every difficult choice between necessities, every moment of quiet desperation that Marcus's theft had forced upon her. Sophia stared at a photograph taken outside a local bookstore, an older woman in a worn coat, counting change from her purse to buy a clearance paperback. The woman's face was dignified, despite her obvious poverty, her bearing still carrying traces of someone who'd once known better circumstances. This was Marcus's mother. This was the woman whose money had funded his penthouse apartment, his luxury cars, his casual displays of wealth. And he'd been watching her suffer with what appeared to be scientific detachment. Sophia's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How's the file retrieval coming? Need those digital archives cleaned today." She stared at the message, her conscience warring with her career survival instincts. Marcus had given her opportunities no other employer would have considered. She was 28, the daughter of immigrants, working her way through night school toward her MBA. Crossing Marcus Blackwood wouldn't just cost her this job. He had enough influence to ensure she never worked in the tech industry again. But the photograph on her screen showed a woman who looked like Sophia's own grandmother, proud, resilient, and completely unaware that her own son was orchestrating her misery. 2 hours later, Sophia sat in a corner booth at Harbor Coffee, a folder thick, with documents hidden in her oversized purse. She'd chosen this cafe because it was far from the business district, frequented by college students and retirees, rather than the professional crowd that might recognize her as Marcus Blackwood's assistant. She'd found Eleanor Blackwood's phone number in one of the surveillance reports. The conversation had been brief, tense. David Chen had been suspicious of her motives, and Eleanor had sounded exhausted. But when Sophia mentioned the trust fund documents, the line had gone silent for a long moment before Eleanor agreed to meet. Now, watching the cafe door, Sophia wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Eleanor entered first, followed by a man Sophia assumed was David Chen. The older woman moved with careful dignity, her clothes neat but obviously inexpensive. When their eyes met across the cafe, Sophia saw something that nearly broke her resolve. Hope mixed with desperate wariness. The look of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Sophia stood, extending her hand. "I'm Sophia Reyes." Eleanor's handshake was firm, her eyes searching. "You work for my son." "I do." Sophia gestured for them to sit. "Or I did. I'm not sure anymore." David Chen studied her with the practiced suspicion of a lawyer who'd dealt with too many people bearing gifts that turned out to be traps. "Why are you here, Ms. Reyes? What do you want?" Sophia reached into her purse and withdrew a single photograph, the surveillance shot of Eleanor outside the bookstore. She placed it on the table between them, watching Eleanor's face as recognition dawned. "He had you watched," Sophia said quietly. "For years. While you struggled to pay rent, while you counted change for groceries, he was having you photographed like you were some kind of criminal." Eleanor's hand moved to the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges with something that might have been disbelief or grief. "How long?" "The reports go back 8 years. Maybe longer." Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to understand. I didn't know. When I processed those quarterly reports, I thought they were his inheritance. I never realized." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. David leaned forward, his expression still wary. "What changed? Why come to us now?" Sophia met his eyes directly. "Because he asked me to destroy the evidence. All of it. Electronic records, backup files, everything that proves what he's done to her." She turned to Eleanor. "I can't be part of that. I won't." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Sophia could see the tears gathering. "What evidence?" Sophia opened the folder and spread its contents across the small table. Bank transfer records, email communications, investment reports, a paper trail that documented 10 years of systematic theft and emotional abuse. "Everything," she said simply. "Every dollar he stole, every lie he told, every report he commissioned to watch you suffer. It's all here." David's eyes widened as he scanned the documents, his lawyer's mind immediately grasping their significance. This is enough to put him in prison." Eleanor remained focused on the surveillance photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness deeper than anger. "He watched me struggle and did nothing. My own son." "There's more," Sophia said reluctantly. She pulled out a final document, a psychological evaluation Marcus had commissioned from a private firm. He had you psychologically profiled to predict how much hardship you could endure before you gave up entirely. The silence that followed was broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of other conversations. Eleanor stared at the evaluation report, her world reshaping itself around this new understanding of her son's calculated cruelty. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do this?" Sophia had wondered the same thing during the sleepless hours before this meeting. I think he wanted you to need him, to come to him desperate and broken, so he could be the one to save you. On his terms." Eleanor looked up sharply. "But I never came to him." "No," Sophia agreed. "You never came. And I think that made him angrier." David gathered the documents with careful precision. "Ms. Reyes, you understand that coming forward puts you at considerable risk. Marcus has resources, connections." "I know." Sophia's voice was steady. "But some things matter more than job security. Some lines you don't cross, no matter what it costs you." As they prepared to leave, Eleanor touched Sophia's arm. "Thank you. For your courage. For choosing to do what's right." Sophia nodded. unable to trust her voice. As she watched Eleanor and David leave the cafe, she knew her old life was over. But for the first time in 3 years of working for Marcus Blackwood, she felt like she could look at herself in the mirror without shame. The war between mother and son was about to escalate dramatically. And now, Eleanor had the weapons she needed to fight back. The petition filing at the county courthouse should have been a routine legal procedure. One lawyer submitting papers to challenge an estate settlement, a clerk stamping documents and assigning a case number. Instead, David Chen found himself facing a small crowd of reporters who'd somehow learned about Eleanor Blackwood's claim against her tech millionaire son. "Mr. Chen, is it true your client is seeking $12 million from Marcus Blackwood?" The question came from a young woman with a press badge and the hungry look of someone chasing their first big story. David kept his expression neutral as he navigated through the small crowd. "We filed a petition to review the estate settlement of James Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood believes there were irregularities in how her late husband's assets were distributed." "Irregularities?" Another reporter pushed forward. "Are you alleging fraud?" "We're asking the court to examine the facts. That's what the legal system is for." David reached the courthouse steps, turning to face the gathered media. He'd called them himself. Sometimes justice needed witnesses. Mrs. Blackwood spent 10 years believing her husband left her nothing but debt. Evidence has come to light suggesting that wasn't true. Eleanor watched the news coverage from Maggie's diner, her coffee growing cold as she listened to reporters speculate about her motives and her son's response. The story had taken on a life of its own. Wealthy tech entrepreneur versus struggling mother. Family drama played out in public. The kind of human interest story that sold newspapers and drove website clicks. "You holding up okay, hon?" Maggie refilled Eleanor's cup, her voice gruff with protective concern. "I knew it would be hard," Eleanor replied, her eyes not leaving the television screen. "I just didn't expect it to feel so exposed." The diner's other customers were studiously avoiding eye contact, but Eleanor could feel their whispers like insects crawling on her skin. Some probably sympathized with her situation. Others likely saw her as a bitter woman attacking her successful son out of jealousy or spite. The truth was more complex than either narrative allowed, but complexity didn't make for compelling television. On screen, a financial analyst was explaining the mechanics of trust funds, while Marcus's corporate headshot filled the background. Confident, successful, the picture of a man who'd built an empire through brilliance and hard work. The image was carefully curated, Eleanor realized. Everything about her son's public persona had been calculated to inspire exactly this kind of admiration. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "First hearing scheduled for Monday. Marcus has hired Kellerman and Associates." This just got expensive for him. Eleanor Googled the law firm while walking home from the diner. Kellerman and Associates was everything David's legal aid office wasn't. Marble lobbies, partner names that appeared in Fortune 500 annual reports, hourly rates that exceeded Eleanor's monthly income. The message was clear. Marcus intended to crush this challenge before it could gain momentum. By Thursday, Eleanor's story had reached the regional news networks. The narrative had simplified into something more digestible. Coastal town matriarch battles tech mogul son over hidden inheritance. Eleanor winced at the word matriarch. It made her sound like some grand dame from a soap opera rather than a woman who'd spent the morning clipping coupons. The coverage included an interview with Thomas Whitmore, looking distinguished and composed, as he defended his handling of the estate. "Mrs. Blackwood was understandably grieving when we settled her husband's affairs," he said, his voice carrying practiced sympathy. Sometimes grief can distort memory, make someone recall things differently than they actually occurred. Eleanor felt sick watching him. The man who'd stolen from her was now publicly portraying her as a confused old woman whose grief had somehow imagined away $12 million. But it was the interview with Marcus that truly shattered her. He'd chosen his backdrop carefully. Not his penthouse office, but a local coffee shop, surrounded by the casual energy of young entrepreneurs. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, the uniform of approachable success. His smile was warm, his voice tinged with sadness rather than anger. "I love my mother," he said, looking directly into the camera. "But she's been struggling since Dad's death. both financially and emotionally. I think someone has convinced her that there's a simple solution to very complex problems. It breaks my heart that she's been persuaded to pursue this path. The interviewer leaned forward. Are you saying she's being manipulated? Marcus's pause was perfectly timed. I'm saying that desperation makes people vulnerable to those who promise easy answers. My mother deserves better than being used as a pawn in someone else's agenda. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for the remote to turn off the television. He was good, better than she'd given him credit for. To anyone watching, he looked like a concerned son worried about his unstable mother, not a thief trying to protect his crimes. Her phone rang immediately. David's voice was tight with anger. Did you see? I saw it. Eleanor sank onto her sofa, suddenly exhausted. He's turning this into a story about my mental state, isn't he? He's trying to. But Eleanor, we have the documents. We have Sophia's testimony. We have the surveillance reports he commissioned. The facts are on our side. Facts don't always matter if the story is compelling enough. Eleanor had learned that lesson watching James navigate the business world. Perception could be more powerful than truth, especially when wielded by someone with unlimited resources and media training. Then we tell a better story, David said firmly. Monday's hearing is our chance. The courtroom is the one place where his charm and checkbook can't override evidence. The weekend brought more coverage, and with it, the community's division became apparent. Eleanor's mailbox filled with letters, some offering support and sharing similar stories of family betrayal, others accusing her of greed and suggesting she should be grateful for whatever scraps her successful son chose to share. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, came from an elderly woman in the neighboring town. My own daughter took my house from me using legal tricks I didn't understand. No one believed me either. Fight them, dear. Fight them for all of us who trusted the wrong people. Eleanor folded that letter carefully and put it in her purse. She would carry it to court on Monday. Sunday evening, as Eleanor prepared for what felt like the most important day of her life, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, Marcus's voice filled her small apartment. Hello, Mother. Eleanor's throat tightened. Marcus. I saw the news coverage. You've become quite the celebrity. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it more threatening than open hostility would have been. I never wanted this to be public, Eleanor said truthfully. No? Then drop the case. Fire your lawyer. Go back to your quiet life. And this all disappears. And you keep the money you stole from me. The line went quiet for a moment. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost its warmth. I didn't steal anything, Mother. I managed assets that were placed under my discretion. Dad understood that you wouldn't have been able to handle that kind of responsibility. That's not what the trust documents say. Trust documents can be interpreted many ways. Just ask any estate lawyer. Marcus's voice carried a certainty that chilled Eleanor. But here's what can't be interpreted differently. If you continue this charade, I'll be forced to present evidence about your mental state after Dad's death. The depression, the drinking, the times you had to be hospitalized for your own safety. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The months after James's death had been dark, filled with grief so profound, she'd sometimes felt untethered from reality. There had been wine to numb the pain, sleepless nights that blended into disorienting days, and yes, one brief hospitalization when Maggie had found her in her car in the garage with the engine running. She'd never told anyone about the worst of those days. But Marcus had been watching her for years. Of course he knew. That was grief, she whispered. I was mourning your father. I'm sure that's how you remember it. But medical records tell a different story. Psychiatric evaluations, medication prescriptions, concerned neighbor reports about erratic behavior. His voice was gentle, almost caring. A jury might wonder if someone in that condition could really understand complex financial documents. They might think you signed papers you didn't comprehend and are now having false memories about what you were promised. Eleanor closed her eyes, understanding the trap he'd laid. Even her lowest moments, her most private struggles, had become weapons in his arsenal. You would destroy me publicly to protect yourself? I would protect my family's reputation from damaging accusations, Marcus replied smoothly. Drop this, Mother. Go back to your volunteer work and your simple life. Accept that some things are beyond your understanding. And if I don't, then everyone will know exactly how unstable you became after Dad died. Every medication, every hospitalization, every moment you couldn't cope with reality. Is that really how you want to be remembered? The line went dead, leaving Eleanor alone with the weight of his threat. Marcus hadn't just stolen her money. He'd been collecting ammunition to destroy her credibility from the moment she might threaten his control. But as Eleanor sat in her small apartment, surrounded by the evidence David had gathered and the letters from strangers who believed in her fight, she realized something important. The worst thing Marcus could reveal about her was that she'd been human, that she'd grieved deeply, struggled with loss, and sometimes failed to be strong enough for the weight of her sorrow. Those weren't shameful secrets. They were the experiences of someone who'd loved deeply and lost everything, only to find the strength to keep living. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of coastal weather that seemed to match the gravity of the day. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best outfit, a navy dress she'd owned for years but kept for special occasions, paired with the pearl earrings James had given her for their 20th anniversary. The courthouse was packed. Media vans lined the street, and a crowd of spectators had gathered despite the early hour. Eleanor felt exposed walking through them, but David's steady presence beside her provided an anchor of calm. Remember, he said quietly as they climbed the courthouse steps, this is just the first hearing. We're presenting our evidence and establishing the legal framework. The judge needs to understand what we're alleging and why we believe we can prove it. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor got her first look at Marcus's legal team. 3 lawyers in expensive suits flanked a table covered with documents and tablets. At their center sat a woman Eleanor recognized from the news, Sandra Kellerman herself, the firm's founding partner and a lawyer known for defending Fortune 500 companies against class action suits. Marcus sat behind them, looking every inch the successful businessman wrongly accused. He'd chosen his courtroom attire carefully, a dark suit that spoke of success without ostentation, his expression serious but not hostile. When his eyes met Eleanor's across the courtroom, he offered the faintest of smiles. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, her voice cutting through the murmur of spectators and media. She was younger than Eleanor had expected, with silver-streaked hair and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd seen every kind of legal drama. This is a petition to review the estate settlement of James Blackwood, deceased, Judge Morrison announced. The petitioner, Eleanor Blackwood, alleges irregularities in the distribution of assets. Mr. Chen, you may present your preliminary arguments. David stood, and Eleanor felt a surge of pride watching him command the courtroom with quiet authority. This was why he'd left corporate law, not for the money or prestige, but for moments like this, when the law could serve justice rather than power. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mrs. Blackwood was systematically defrauded by her own son, working in conspiracy with the estate attorney Thomas Whitmore. While she believed she was inheriting debt, Marcus Blackwood was secretly controlling a $12 million trust fund that rightfully belonged to her. David laid out their case with methodical precision, introducing each piece of evidence and explaining how it supported their claims. The altered documents, the hidden trust fund, the surveillance reports, each revelation drew murmurs from the gallery and sharp looks from the opposing counsel. When David finished, Sandra Kellerman rose to respond. Her voice was crisp, professional, carrying the authority of someone who'd never lost a case she cared about winning. Your Honor, what we have here is a desperate attempt by a woman in financial distress to rewrite history to suit her current needs. Mrs. Blackwood was fully informed about her husband's estate. She signed all necessary documents with full knowledge of their contents. The fact that she now regrets those decisions doesn't constitute fraud. Kellerman painted Eleanor as a woman whose grief had clouded her judgment, who'd made poor financial decisions, and was now seeking to blame others for the consequences. She suggested that any irregularities in the documents were the result of normal estate planning complications, not criminal conspiracy. Furthermore, Your Honor, we intend to present evidence about Mrs. Blackwood's mental state during the estate settlement period. Medical records will show that she was under psychiatric care for severe depression and was taking medications that could have affected her cognitive function. Eleanor felt the courtroom's attention shift to her, could almost hear the whispers of speculation. This was Marcus's counterstrike. If he couldn't hide the evidence, he would destroy her credibility instead. Judge Morrison studied both legal teams with the careful attention of someone weighing complex arguments. The court finds sufficient evidence to warrant a full review of the estate's settlement. However, I'm also concerned about the allegations regarding Mrs. Blackwood's mental competency during the relevant period. Eleanor's heart sank, but Judge Morrison continued. Therefore, I'm ordering a complete forensic audit of the Blackwood estate, including all trust funds and related entities. Both sides will have equal access to all financial records. Additionally, I'm appointing a guardian ad litem to represent Mrs. Blackwood's interests during any examination of her mental state. It wasn't the complete victory Eleanor had hoped for, but it wasn't the dismissal Marcus had clearly expected either. As the court recessed, Eleanor watched her son's careful composure crack slightly, just enough to reveal the anger beneath his polished exterior. Outside the courthouse, David addressed the waiting media while Eleanor stood beside him, drawing strength from his confidence. Today's ruling proves that the court takes these allegations seriously, he said. Mrs. Blackwood looks forward to the full truth being revealed through the audit process. A reporter called out, Mrs. Blackwood, how do you respond to allegations about your mental state? Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I was grieving my husband and struggling to understand complex legal documents. If that makes me mentally unfit, then most widows in my situation would be equally disqualified from managing their own affairs. I trusted the wrong people, but that doesn't make me incompetent. As they walked away from the courthouse, Eleanor felt the weight of what lay ahead. The legal battle would intensify, the media scrutiny would worsen, and Marcus would undoubtedly escalate his attacks on her character. But for the first time in 10 years, she was fighting back. And that felt like victory enough for one day. That evening, as Eleanor watched the news coverage of the hearing, she noticed something that gave her hope. The reporters weren't just repeating Marcus's narrative anymore. They were asking harder questions, examining the evidence David had presented, investigating the claims on both sides. The story was becoming more complex, more honest. And in that complexity, Eleanor thought she could see the beginning of justice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Saw the news? You were incredible today. Some fights are worth the cost. Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the people who'd found the courage to stand with her. David, who'd risked his reputation on her case. Sophia, who'd sacrificed her career for truth. Even the strangers who'd sent letters of support. Marcus had power and money and carefully crafted public image. But Eleanor had something more powerful. The truth, and the growing conviction that it would ultimately prevail. The war was far from over. But today, she'd proven she could fight. Eleanor sat in her apartment that evening, staring at a photograph from her closet. Marcus at 8, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a finger painting of their family. She'd meant to hang it on the refrigerator, but James had been managing some work crisis, and the moment had passed. The painting had been forgotten, like so many other moments. David's voice on the phone was exhausted. The forensic accountant starts tomorrow. But Eleanor, Kellerman's team will dig into your personal history. Every medical record, every vulnerable moment after James died. Marcus already threatened me with that, Eleanor said quietly. He knows about the hospitalization, the dark months when grief nearly destroyed me. She told David about the argument that had shattered their relationship 15 years ago. Marcus, 27 and successful, had wanted to buy them a vacation home in Tuscany, a grand gesture to prove his worth. But James had been uncomfortable, feeling his autonomy threatened. We don't need you to take care of us, James had said coldly. Eleanor had sided with her husband. Your father's right. We can take care of ourselves. Marcus's face had crumpled. I thought maybe I'd finally done something that would make you both proud of me. We are proud of you, Eleanor had replied, but the damage was done. No, you're not. I'm just the son who never quite measures up, who tries too hard and loves too much. His voice had carried devastating pain. Well, I won't make that mistake again. He'd left that night and never returned. Eleanor had expected him to cool down, but pride had calcified into permanent silence. I failed him. Eleanor whispered to David, long before he stole from me, I failed him as a mother. Meanwhile, Marcus discovered Sophia had vanished completely. Apartment cleaned out, phone disconnected. Only 3 people had known about the surveillance reports, and now his perfect assistant had disappeared with evidence that could destroy him. When Thomas Whitmore arrived at Marcus's office, the old lawyer looked terrible. Unshaven, shaking, desperate. I called the state bar about whistleblower protection, Whitmore confessed. I'm 73 years old. I won't spend my final years in prison while my family name gets destroyed. You're not confessing anything, Marcus said coldly. She has everything. Surveillance reports, financial transfers, emails about manipulating your mother's emotional state. Quote, everything we did was technically legal, Marcus replied, though the words sounded hollow. Whitmore met his eyes directly. I'm going to tell them everything. About the forged documents, the surveillance, how you convinced me to steal from your own mother. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. If you do that, I'll make sure everyone knows this was your idea. I've been recording our conversations, documenting your signatures above mine. Guess who the evidence will point to as the mastermind? Whitmore collapsed into a chair, realizing Marcus had been 3 steps ahead all along. Even in confession, he'd be painted as the villain. What do you want from me? Whitmore asked, defeated. Silence, loyalty, help cleaning up Sophia's mess. Marcus leaned back. Do that, and we both survive. Fail me, and your family watches their reputation burn while mine stays intact. As Whitmore left, Marcus stared out at the city he'd conquered. Everything was threatened by his mother's unexpected resilience and an assistant's inconvenient conscience. 3 miles away, Eleanor put the childhood photograph back in its box. She would fight through to the end, not just for the money, but for the boy who'd once painted their family with such love. Somewhere inside the man trying to destroy her, that boy still existed. Maybe, if she fought hard enough, she could still save them both. But first, she had to win. Thomas Whitmore didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, surrounded by 40 years of legal achievements, framed diplomas, awards from the Bar Association, photographs with judges and politicians, all of it now feeling like evidence of a life built on foundations that were crumbling beneath him. At 4 a.m., he made the call that would change everything. FBI Financial Crimes Division. The voice was crisp, despite the early hour. This is Thomas Whitmore. I'm an attorney, and I need to report a conspiracy involving trust fund fraud. His voice barely shook. I was part of it, and I want to cooperate fully. 3 hours later, federal agents were sitting in his living room, recording equipment humming softly on his coffee table, while Whitmore methodically destroyed his own life. He detailed every forged document, every illegal transfer, every moment when Marcus Blackwood had convinced him to betray the most basic principles of legal ethics. How much money are we talking about, Mr. Whitmore? Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to David, despite the shared surname, leaned forward, her expression carefully neutral. $12.3 million in the primary trust. But there were other accounts, shell companies, that Marcus established to funnel money through. The total could be closer to $18 million. Whitmore's hands trembled as he signed the cooperation agreement. And the surveillance. He spent hundreds of thousands having his own mother watched, documented, psychologically profiled. We'll need all documentation, all communications, everything you have. Whitmore gestured toward 3 file boxes he'd prepared. It's all there. 15 years of conspiracy, all meticulously documented because Marcus insisted on keeping records of everything. He said it was insurance, but I think he enjoyed having proof of his control. While Whitmore was dismantling Marcus's empire from the inside, Sophia Reyes was 2 states away, sitting in a safe house that David Chen had arranged through a network of domestic violence advocates. She'd fled not just Marcus's employment, but his entire sphere of influence, understanding that a man who could systematically torture his own mother wouldn't hesitate to destroy a disloyal employee. Her phone buzzed with yet another call from an unknown number. Marcus had been trying to reach her for days, using different phones, different approaches. The messages had evolved from professional courtesy to barely contained threats. The latest voicemail made her hands shake. "Sophia, I know you're protecting yourself, but you need to understand what happens to people who betray me. Ask Jennifer Walsh about her experience trying to cross me." "Oh wait, you can't. She's working night shifts at a convenience store now." Jennifer Walsh had been Marcus's previous assistant, fired 2 years ago for reasons Sophia had never fully understood. Now she wondered if Jennifer had discovered something she shouldn't have, tried to do the right thing, and been systematically destroyed for her conscience. The safe house phone rang, and David's voice carried urgency. "Sophia, we need you to testify. The FBI is building a case, and your evidence is crucial. But I have to warn you, things are moving fast, and Marcus is getting desperate." "How desperate?" Sophia asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "Desperate enough that he's making mistakes, big ones." Marcus was indeed making mistakes, the biggest of which was his appearance at Thursday's emergency court hearing. Judge Morrison had called the session after the FBI had contacted her office about ongoing criminal proceedings that intersected with the civil case. Eleanor sat in the gallery, watching her son enter the courtroom flanked by his legal team, and was shocked by what she saw. The composed businessman who'd humiliated her at the charity gala was gone. Marcus's expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, the dark circles under his eyes, or the way his hands shook slightly as he sat down. When he turned to scan the courtroom, his eyes met Eleanor's, and she saw something that made her heart clench despite everything. He looked like a frightened child. "Your Honor," Sandra Kellerman stood, her usual commanding presence slightly diminished. "We request a postponement pending resolution of any criminal matters that may affect this case." Judge Morrison consulted the papers before her. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Counselor. The FBI has indicated that the criminal investigation stems directly from evidence presented in this civil matter. We'll proceed." David rose to address the court. "Your Honor, we've received additional evidence that fundamentally changes the scope of this case. The defendant didn't just hide Mrs. Blackwood's inheritance. He's been systematically draining it for over a decade to fund his personal lifestyle." The forensic accountant took the stand, her testimony methodical and devastating. She traced money from Eleanor's trust through a labyrinth of shell companies and investment vehicles, all designed to obscure the fact that Marcus had been treating his mother's inheritance as his personal bank account. The defendant established 17 separate corporate entities, she explained, pointing to a complex chart. Money would flow from the trust into these companies, then be used for personal expenses, real estate purchases, luxury vehicles, even funding his tech startup's initial operations. Eleanor listened to the recitation of her stolen life with growing numbness. The penthouse apartment, the Tesla, the private jet trips, all of it purchased with money that should have secured her comfort in her golden years. But it was Marcus's reaction that truly broke her heart. As the evidence mounted, as the full scope of his theft became undeniable, he began to unravel visibly. His lawyer tried to maintain composure, but Marcus himself seemed to be experiencing some kind of breakdown. He whispered urgently to Kellerman, his voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. "Make it stop," Eleanor heard him say. "Just make it all stop." When Judge Morrison asked if the defense had any response to the accountant's findings, Marcus stood abruptly, ignoring his lawyer's restraining hand. "Your Honor, He stopped, his voice cracking. For a moment, Eleanor saw not the successful businessman, but the 8-year-old boy from the photograph, lost and desperate for someone to tell him everything would be okay. "Mr. Blackwood." Judge Morrison's voice was firm but not unkind. "Please consult with your attorney before." "She's my mother," Marcus said, the words emerging like a confession. "She's my mother, and I destroyed her because I couldn't forgive her for not loving me enough." The courtroom fell silent. Kellerman was frantically trying to get Marcus to sit down, but he seemed beyond her control now, 15 years of carefully suppressed pain spilling out in front of cameras and reporters. "I was 7 when Dad missed my birthday party because of work. 8 when he canceled our fishing trip for a client meeting. 10 when Mom chose to attend his company party instead of my school play." Marcus's voice was raw, childlike. They loved his success more than they loved me, so I decided to become successful enough that they'd have no choice but to love me back." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. This wasn't the cold, calculating man who'd tormented her. This was her broken son, still trapped in childhood wounds that had festered for decades. "But it was never enough," Marcus continued, his lawyers now openly trying to silence him. "No matter what I achieved, they were prouder of each other than they were of me. So when Dad died and left her that money that was supposed to prove he loved her more than anything, I thought if I took it away, maybe she'd finally need me." "Mr. Blackwood, you need to stop talking," Kellerman said urgently. Marcus turned to look at Eleanor, his face streaked with tears. "But you never came to me, Mom. You never asked for help. You just endured. Like loving me wasn't worth swallowing your pride." Eleanor stood, her own voice breaking. "Marcus, the defendant will resume his seat," Judge Morrison commanded, but her tone had softened. "We'll recess for 30 minutes. As court officers led a shaking Marcus from the room, Eleanor realized that her victory had come at a price she'd never calculated. She'd wanted justice, had fought for the truth, but watching her son's complete emotional collapse, she wondered if winning meant destroying what little chance they had left to heal their relationship. The boy who'd painted their family with such hope had finally broken completely, and Eleanor wasn't sure if all the money in the world could put either of them back together again. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions she couldn't hear over the sound of her own heart breaking. She'd spent 15 years believing Marcus had chosen cruelty over love. Now she understood he'd chosen it over the vulnerability of admitting how desperately he'd always needed her to choose him back. Eleanor stood outside Marcus's penthouse building for 20 minutes before finally approaching the doorman. The events in the courtroom had replayed in her mind throughout the sleepless night. Her son's breakdown, his raw confession of childhood pain, the way he'd looked at her with the desperate eyes of a boy who'd never stopped needing his mother's love. David had tried to dissuade her from coming. "Eleanor, he's facing federal charges now. Anything you say to him could be used against you or against him. Let the lawyers handle this." But this wasn't about lawyers anymore. This was about a mother and son who'd spent 15 years punishing each other for wounds that had festered since childhood. The doorman, recognizing her from the news coverage, looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, Mr. Blackwood left instructions that he wasn't to be disturbed." "Tell him Eleanor is here," she said quietly. "Tell him his mother would like to talk." 10 minutes later, she stood outside the penthouse door she'd never seen, waiting for her son to decide whether to let her into the fortress he'd built to keep the world, and her, at bay. When the door opened, Eleanor barely recognized the man standing there. Marcus looked like he'd aged years in the 2 days since his courtroom breakdown. His hair was uncombed, his expensive clothes wrinkled, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who'd stopped sleeping. But what struck her most was how young he seemed. Stripped of his corporate armor, he looked vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. "Mom." The word came out cracked, uncertain. "Hello, Marcus?" They stood in the doorway for a moment, neither knowing how to bridge 15 years of silence. Finally, Marcus stepped aside, gesturing her into the sprawling apartment that her stolen money had purchased. Eleanor had expected ostentation, but the space felt sterile, impersonal. Expensive furniture that looked barely used, artwork that seemed chosen by a decorator rather than personal taste. Windows that offered stunning views of a city that suddenly felt distant and cold. It was the home of a successful man, but not a happy one. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" Marcus's voice carried an odd formality, as if he were hosting a business meeting rather than seeing his mother for the first time in over a decade. "Coffee would be nice." Eleanor settled onto a leather sofa that probably cost more than her annual rent, watching Marcus move through his gleaming kitchen with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control through routine. When he returned with 2 cups, his hands were shaking slightly. He sat across from her, the coffee table between them feeling like an ocean. "Why are you here?" he asked finally. Eleanor studied her son's face, seeing traces of the boy she'd raised beneath the exhaustion and fear. "Because yesterday in that courtroom, I saw my child in pain. And despite everything that's happened, despite all the hurt and anger, you're still my son." Marcus's carefully constructed composure cracked. "Your son who stole from you. Your son who had you watched like a criminal. Your son who systematically destroyed your life for 15 years. His voice was bitter, self-loathing. What kind of mother comes to comfort a monster like that? The kind who remembers rocking that monster to sleep during thunderstorms, Eleanor replied softly. The kind who taught him to tie his shoes and read bedtime stories and kiss scraped knees better. Marcus, what you did was unforgivable. But you're not irredeemable. Aren't I? Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the windows. Do you know what I did this morning? I calculated how much of your trust fund I've spent on this apartment, on my cars, on maintaining the lifestyle that made me feel important. $14.7 million. I've been living off my mother's stolen inheritance for so long I don't even know who I am without it. Eleanor joined him at the window, standing close enough to see her own reflection alongside his in the glass. Then maybe it's time to find out. It's too late for that. Marcus's voice was hollow. The FBI has everything now, Whitmore confessed, Sophia testified, and my own courtroom breakdown was recorded for posterity. I'll be lucky if I avoid federal prison. Is that what you're most afraid of? Prison? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his reflection wavering in the glass. No, I'm most afraid that you'll never forgive me, that I destroyed the only relationship that ever really mattered for the sake of revenge that was never worth having. Eleanor felt tears gathering. Marcus, I need to tell you something. About that night you left. About the things your father and I said. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Eleanor turned to face him directly. We were wrong, not about the house. That wasn't the issue. We were wrong about how we made you feel unwanted, unimportant, like your love was a burden rather than a gift. Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands, years of suppressed pain pouring out in ragged sobs. I just wanted you to be proud of me. I worked so hard, achieved so much, and it never felt like enough. Eleanor knelt beside his chair, her hand on his shoulder like she'd done when he was small. Oh, sweetheart, we were proud of you, so proud. But your father and I were both so caught up in proving our own worth through work and success that we forgot to show you how much you meant to us just for being you. Then why did you choose him over me? The question came out like a child's plea. Every time there was a choice between Dad's work and my needs, you chose his work. Every school event he missed, every birthday he was too busy for, you made excuses for him. You protected his priorities instead of mine. Eleanor closed her eyes, the truth of his words cutting deep. Because I was afraid. Your father was brilliant, driven, but he was also fragile in ways I didn't understand then. His work wasn't just his career. It was how he proved he deserved love, how he convinced himself he was worthy of our family. I thought if I supported him, protected his confidence, he'd eventually find balance. But he never did. He never did. And in protecting him, I failed to protect you. Eleanor's voice broke. I should have insisted he make time for you. I should have demanded that our family come before his ambitions. I should have seen that you needed advocates, not excuses. Marcus looked up at her, his eyes red but searching. Did you ever love me as much as you loved him? The question hung in the air between them. 15 years of pain and misunderstanding crystallized into a single desperate need for truth. Eleanor cupped her son's face in her hands, seeing both the successful man and the wounded child. Marcus, I loved you differently than I loved your father. A parent's love and a spouse's love aren't the same thing. But if you're asking whether you mattered as much to me, whether losing you hurt as deeply as losing him, she paused, searching for words that could bridge the chasm between them. When your father died, I lost my partner, my companion, my best friend. When you walked away, I lost a piece of my soul. I've grieved for both of you every day since. Then, why didn't you come after me? The question was barely a whisper. When I left that night, why didn't you follow? Why didn't you call or write or show up at my apartment demanding we work things out? Eleanor sank back on her heels, the weight of this admission almost too much to bear. Because I was proud, because I thought you needed to come to me first, needed to apologize for the harsh things you'd said, because I convinced myself that if you really loved me, you'd come back on your own. And I was waiting for you to prove you cared enough to fight for me. So we both waited. For 15 years, we both waited for the other to make the first move. They sat in silence, the magnitude of their mutual failure settling around them like dust from a collapsed building. Outside, the city went about its business. But inside the penthouse, two people were finally excavating the ruins of their relationship. There's something else, Marcus said eventually, about Dad's death, about the timing of everything. Eleanor waited, sensing this was important. He called me 3 days before the heart attack. He wanted to meet, said he had something important to discuss. Marcus's voice was hollow with regret. I hung up on him. I was still angry about the house incident, still nursing my wounded pride. I told him I didn't have time for family drama. Eleanor felt her heart stop. Marcus, no, you couldn't have known. Couldn't I? He sounded different on the phone. Older, tired, like he needed something from me for the first time in years. Marcus stood, moving restlessly around the room. What if he was trying to apologize? What if he wanted to fix things between us? And I threw it away because I was too stubborn to listen. The heart attack wasn't your fault. But the lost opportunity was, just like this whole nightmare was my fault. Marcus gestured around the apartment, encompassing not just the space but everything it represented. When I saw that trust fund, saw that he'd left you $12 million, I felt like he was buying your forgiveness from beyond the grave. Money he'd never offered me, security he'd never provided when I was struggling to build my business. So you decided I didn't deserve it either. I decided you should know what it felt like to need something from me, to be vulnerable, desperate enough to come asking for help. Marcus's voice grew quiet, ashamed. I thought if you lost everything, you'd eventually swallow your pride and reach out. And then I could be the one to save you, could finally be the son who mattered more than anything else. Eleanor stared at him, the psychological cruelty of his plan finally clear. But I never came to you. You chose dignity over desperation. You worked minimum wage jobs, lived in poverty, struggled with pride intact, rather than give me the satisfaction of needing me. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Even in destitution you were stronger than I gave you credit for. I thought about it, Eleanor admitted. There were nights when I almost called, almost put aside my pride and asked for help. But every time I imagined that conversation, I heard you saying the same things your father might have said. That I was weak, that I couldn't manage my own life, that I needed someone stronger to take care of me. I would never have said that. Wouldn't you? Marcus, you just admitted you orchestrated my poverty to force me into exactly that position. The truth of that hit him like a physical blow. He'd spent years nurturing a fantasy of reconciliation, where he held all the power, where his mother's need would prove his worth. But he'd never considered what that fantasy said about his view of her, or what it revealed about his own capacity for cruelty. God, what have I become? He whispered. You became a man who was hurt so deeply as a child that you built walls to protect yourself. Eleanor said gently. But walls that keep pain out also keep love out, and eventually, the isolation became worse than the original wound. Marcus sank onto the sofa beside her, the fight gone out of him completely. How do we fix this? How do we come back from what I've done? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his question but the bigger issue of what she wanted from the legal case, from their relationship, from whatever remained of their family. The money has to be returned, she said finally. Not because I need it to survive. I've learned I'm stronger than I thought. But because keeping it would mean accepting that theft is forgivable when it comes from family. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. I know, I've already told my lawyers to stop fighting the restitution. The FBI will probably seize most of my assets anyway, and you'll likely face criminal charges. I know that too. He met her eyes directly. I'm not asking you to save me from the consequences, Mom. I'm asking if there's any chance you can forgive me for causing them. Eleanor studied her son's face, seeing not the confident businessman or the wounded child, but simply a man who'd made terrible choices and was finally ready to accept responsibility for them. Forgiveness isn't a switch I can flip, Marcus. It's a choice I'll have to make every day, probably for years. Some days I'll remember the boy who painted our family picture, and forgiveness will come easily. Other days I'll think about the 10 years of poverty you put me through, and it will feel impossible. That's more than I deserve. It's exactly what you deserve. The same messy, complicated, imperfect love that families are built on. The same love I should have shown you better when you were young. They sat together as the afternoon light shifted through the penthouse windows, not talking but simply sharing space without the armor of anger or the weight of secrets. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor felt like she was sitting with her son rather than the stranger he'd become. "What happens now?" Marcus asked eventually. "Now you've faced the legal consequences of your choices. You serve whatever sentence the court decides. You find a way to rebuild your life without stolen money or carefully constructed lies." Eleanor's voice was steady but not unkind. "And if you want, when you're ready, we try to rebuild our relationship too. After everything I've done, you'd be willing to try?" Eleanor reached for his hand, surprised when he didn't pull away. "Marcus, I lost you once because I was too proud to fight for you. I won't make that mistake again. But this time, the relationship we build has to be based on truth, not fantasy. We both have to face who we really are, not who we wish we were." Marcus squeezed her hand, the gesture tentative but real. "I don't know who I am without the success, without the money, without the reputation I've built." "Then maybe it's time to find out," Eleanor said, echoing her earlier words. "Maybe the man you become after losing everything is the man you were always meant to be." As Eleanor prepared to leave, she turned back to look at her son one more time. The penthouse that had seemed so impressive now felt like what it truly was: a gilded prison built from stolen dreams and carefully maintained lies. "Marcus?" "Yes?" "That painting you made when you were 8, the one with our family standing in front of the house, I still have it. When you're ready, when you've found your way back to yourself, I'd like to hang it on my refrigerator. It's 15 years late, but some gestures of love are worth waiting for." As the elevator carried her down from Marcus's tower of lies, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in a decade: hope. Not for easy reconciliation or quick healing, but for the harder, more valuable prospect of real relationship built on truth. The legal battle would continue. Marcus would face justice for his crimes. But for the first time since that devastating night at the charity gala, Eleanor believed that healing, slow, painful, imperfect healing, might actually be possible. The boy who'd painted their family was still there, buried beneath years of pain and poor choices, and Eleanor was finally ready to help him find his way home. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for what the media had dubbed the final showdown in the Blackwood family saga. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the same navy dress she'd worn to the first hearing, not because she lacked options, but because it reminded her of how far she'd traveled from that frightened woman who'd first walked into David's office. 3 weeks had passed since her conversation with Marcus in his penthouse. The FBI's investigation had moved swiftly, and the federal prosecutor had offered Marcus a plea deal: full restitution, 5 years in federal prison, and permanent disbarment for Thomas Whitmore. Marcus had accepted without negotiation, but today's hearing would determine the civil penalties and the final distribution of the recovered assets. Judge Morrison called the court to order, her voice cutting through the murmur of spectators and reporters. "This case has drawn considerable public attention, and I want to remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a theater. We're here to determine the appropriate resolution of a complex family and financial matter." Sandra Kellerman rose first, her usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of defending the indefensible. "Your Honor, while my client accepts responsibility for his actions, we ask the court to consider the extraordinary circumstances that led to this situation. Mr. Blackwood acted out of deep psychological wounds stemming from childhood trauma and abandonment issues." Eleanor watched Marcus as his lawyer spoke. He sat quietly, no longer the confident businessman who'd humiliated her at the charity gala. The federal charges had stripped away his corporate empire, his assets frozen, his reputation destroyed, his future reduced to whatever he could build from prison. But there was something different in his posture now. a kind of peace that hadn't been there during his breakdown. David stood to present their case, his voice steady and professional. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that Mr. Blackwood has accepted criminal responsibility, the civil damages extend far beyond simple restitution. Mrs. Blackwood lost not just money, but 10 years of security, dignity, and peace of mind. The psychological torture of watching someone struggle while you control their fate represents damages that exceed any financial calculation. The prosecutor detailed the scope of Marcus's crimes, the forged documents, the surveillance operation, the systematic theft that had funded his lifestyle while his mother counted pennies. Eleanor listened to the recitation of her stolen years, but found herself watching Marcus's face, rather than focusing on the legal arguments. When Judge Morrison asked if Mrs. Blackwood wished to make a victim impact statement, Eleanor rose slowly. The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the witness stand. Every camera focused on the woman whose decade-long ordeal had captivated the public imagination. Your Honor, Eleanor began, her voice clear and strong, 3 months ago I believed I was a victim of circumstances, a widow left with nothing, forgotten by a son who'd chosen success over family. Today I understand that my story is more complicated than that simple narrative. She turned slightly, including Marcus in her line of sight. What my son did was criminal. He stole money that was rightfully mine, yes, but more than that, he stole my sense of security, my trust in the people I loved, my faith that the world was fundamentally fair. Those thefts deserve punishment, and I won't ask this court to excuse them because of family bonds. Marcus's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away from his mother's steady gaze. However, Eleanor continued, I've learned something important during this ordeal. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about truth, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. My son committed these crimes because he was a wounded child who never learned how to heal. That doesn't excuse his actions, but it explains them in ways that matter for what happens next. Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts for the most important words she'd ever spoken in a courtroom. I want full restitution of the stolen funds. I want my son to face the criminal consequences of his choices. But I don't want vengeance masquerading as justice. This court has the power to either destroy what remains of our family or create space for healing alongside accountability. I'm asking for the latter. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. What specifically are you requesting, Mrs. Blackwood? I'm requesting that the restitution be placed in a trust that I control, but with provisions for my son's basic needs when he's released from prison. Not luxury, but dignity. I'm requesting that his sentence include mandatory psychological counseling, because trauma that goes untreated tends to create more victims. And I'm requesting that this court recognize that families can be both broken and worth saving. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Even David looked surprised. They'd discussed Eleanor's statement, but she'd kept her final decision to herself until this moment. Judge Morrison called for order, then asked, Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to respond to your mother's statement? Marcus stood slowly, his voice thick with emotion but clear in its intent. Your Honor, my mother is showing me a grace I don't deserve and haven't earned. I accept full responsibility for every crime detailed in these proceedings. I stole from her, lied to her, and subjected her to psychological torture that no person should endure, especially not from their own child. He turned to face Eleanor directly. Mom, I can't undo the damage I've caused or give you back the years I stole, but I can promise you this. I will serve whatever sentence this court imposes with the goal of becoming a man worthy of the forgiveness you're offering. I will get the help I need to understand how I became someone capable of such cruelty. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the love you've never stopped showing me, even when I didn't deserve it. Judge Morrison studied both parties for a long moment before delivering her ruling. This case represents one of the most complex family situations this court has encountered. Mr. Blackwood's crimes were systematic, cruel, and inexcusable. However, the victim's request for restorative rather than purely punitive justice reflects a wisdom that this court respects. The judge outlined her decision: full restitution to Eleanor, criminal prosecution to proceed as agreed, but with provisions for Marcus's basic rehabilitation upon release. The trust fund would be restored to Eleanor's control, with a modest provision for Marcus's essential needs during his reintegration into society, contingent on his completion of psychological treatment and community service. This court believes in accountability but also in the possibility of redemption, Judge Morrison concluded. Mr. Blackwood will serve his sentence and face the consequences of his actions. But Mrs. Blackwood's faith in the possibility of healing gives this court hope that something positive can emerge from this tragedy. As court adjourned, Eleanor found herself surrounded by reporters, but their questions felt distant and unimportant. She watched Marcus being led away in handcuffs, their eyes meeting one last time before he disappeared through the courthouse's back entrance. Outside, David shook his head in amazement. "Eleanor, you realize you just gave up millions in additional damages? You could have destroyed him completely." "I spent 10 years believing I had nothing," Eleanor replied, watching the sunset paint the courthouse steps in warm light. "Now I have my life back, my independence restored, and the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with my son. What more could I possibly need?" Maggie appeared at her elbow, gruff as always, but with tears in her eyes. "You did good, Ellie. Real good." That evening, Eleanor sat in her small apartment, though she could now afford much better, and wrote a letter to Marcus. Not about forgiveness or reconciliation, but about practical things. The books she thought he might want in prison, the psychological resources David had recommended, the community service organization where she'd arranged for him to work upon his release. But she ended with something more personal. "The finger painting you made when you were 8 is hanging on my refrigerator now, where it always should have been. When you're ready to come home, really home to the family we can still choose to be, it will be here waiting for you." 3 blocks away, Sophia Reyes watched the news coverage from her new apartment. She'd taken a position with Eleanor's nascent foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families navigate legal and financial crises. Her first case involved an elderly man whose daughter had been stealing his Social Security checks. Some fights, she'd learned, were worth the cost. And 5 states away, in the federal holding facility where he'd await transfer to prison, Marcus Blackwood sat in his cell writing his own letter, the first honest words he'd written to his mother in 15 years. He had 5 years to figure out who he wanted to be when he got out. For the first time since childhood, he had hope that the answer might be someone worthy of love. The Blackwood family's story was far from over. But for the first time in a generation, it was being written in truth instead of lies, in hope instead of bitterness, in the possibility of redemption instead of the certainty of destruction. Justice, Eleanor had learned, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about creating space for healing while holding people accountable for the harm they'd caused. Today, she'd chosen both. 6 months after the courthouse victory, Eleanor Blackwood stood in the main conference room of the Coastal Family Crisis Center, watching Sophia Reyes conduct an intake interview with a trembling woman whose adult son had been systematically stealing from her retirement account. The parallels to her own story weren't lost on Eleanor, but now she was in a position to help rather than simply endure. "Mrs. Patterson, what you're describing isn't your fault," Sophia said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed both sides of family financial abuse. "And it's not hopeless. There are legal remedies, and more importantly, there are people who understand exactly what you're going through." Eleanor smiled, remembering her own first meeting with David in his cramped legal aid office. The difference was that Mrs. Patterson wouldn't have to face this battle alone or with limited resources. The Blackwood Foundation, funded primarily by Eleanor's restored inheritance, provided comprehensive support, legal representation, counseling services, financial planning, and most importantly, a community of people who understood that family betrayal created wounds that went far deeper than stolen money. "Eleanor?" David's voice came from the doorway, pulling her from her observations. "The reporter from the Chronicle is here for the interview." Eleanor nodded, smoothing her jacket. A new one, well-made but not ostentatious. She'd learned to navigate the space between her old poverty and her restored wealth carefully, understanding that both extremes could become prisons if she wasn't thoughtful about her choices. The interview went well, focusing on the Foundation's work rather than the sensational details of her personal story. Eleanor had become skilled at redirecting attention from her family's drama to the broader issue of elder financial abuse, though she was always honest about her own experiences when they served to help others. "What surprised you most about starting this foundation?" the reporter asked as they concluded. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I expected to help people with legal and financial problems. What I didn't expect was how much healing would happen for me in the process. When you're helping someone else navigate crisis, you're not dwelling on your own pain. You're transforming it into something useful." After the reporter left, Eleanor found David in his new office. Still modestly furnished, but spacious enough for the growing caseload the foundation had made possible. Their professional partnership had deepened into something more personal over the months, though they'd both been careful to let their relationship develop naturally, rather than rushing into something built on shared trauma. "How did the interview go?" David asked, looking up from a case file. "Good, I think." She seemed more interested in the foundation's impact than in rehashing the courthouse drama. Eleanor settled into the chair across from his desk, the same position she'd occupied 6 months ago, when she'd been a desperate woman seeking help, rather than a partner in creating solutions. "Speaking of impact," David smiled. "We got the final numbers from the state office. The model we've developed here is being replicated in 6 other counties. Turns out there was a real need for comprehensive family crisis intervention." Eleanor felt a familiar warmth of satisfaction. The foundation had started as a way to channel her restored resources into something meaningful, but it had become much more a proof of concept that healing was possible, that families could survive even devastating betrayals if they had proper support. "Any word from Marcus?" David asked, his tone carefully neutral. He'd learned not to judge Eleanor's ongoing relationship with her son, though she knew he sometimes worried about her emotional well-being. "His letter came yesterday," Eleanor replied, pulling an envelope from her purse. 3 pages this time. "He's finished the intensive therapy program and is starting work in the prison's financial literacy education program, teaching other inmates about budgeting and debt management." The irony isn't lost on any of us. David's expression softened. Over the months, he'd watched Eleanor navigate the complex process of rebuilding trust with Marcus while maintaining appropriate boundaries. It wasn't easy. Some weeks brought progress, others brought setbacks, but the overall trajectory was positive. "He's asking if he can call me next week," Eleanor continued. "The prison is allowing supervised video calls now, and he wants to show me the curriculum he's developing for the financial literacy program. How do you feel about that?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering. Proud, cautious, hopeful, all at once. She met David's eyes. "He's doing the work, David. Real work, not just serving time. The psychologist says his progress has been remarkable, but more importantly, I can hear it in his letters. He's not the same man who stole from me." "People can change," David agreed, "but that doesn't mean you have to forget what happened." "No, it doesn't. But it means I can choose to build something new, rather than just protecting myself from the past." That evening, Eleanor prepared dinner in her new kitchen. Not the penthouse luxury that Marcus's stolen money might have afforded, but a comfortable space in a modest house with a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. She'd chosen to live simply, understanding that neither poverty nor wealth defined her worth, but that financial security gave her choices she'd learned to value. The doorbell rang at precisely 6 o'clock, and Eleanor opened it to find Maggie O'Sullivan holding a bottle of wine and wearing what passed for her dressed-up clothes. "You sure about this dinner party idea?" Maggie asked, stepping into the entryway. "Seems like a lot of fuss for a Tuesday night." "It's not fuss, it's intention," Eleanor replied, accepting a hug from her oldest friend. "How many Tuesday nights have we spent together over the years without really celebrating the fact that we made it through another day intact?" Sophia arrived next, carrying homemade bread and looking more relaxed than Eleanor had ever seen her. The young woman had found her calling in the foundation's work, and the confidence that came from using her skills for meaningful purposes had transformed her in visible ways. David was the last to arrive, bringing flowers and the slightly bemused expression of someone still adjusting to being part of a chosen family rather than just a professional relationship. Eleanor watched him interact with Maggie and Sophia, noting how naturally he fit into the constellation of people who'd become central to her life. As they sat around Eleanor's dinner table, sharing a meal that was neither elaborate nor simple but simply intentional, Eleanor reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed her story from one of victimhood to one of agency. The money Marcus had stolen had been returned, but more importantly, the life he'd tried to control had become authentically her own. "Toast," Maggie announced, raising her wine glass. "To Eleanor, for showing us all that it's never too late to fight back." "To all of us," Eleanor corrected, "for proving that healing is possible, even when it seems impossible." They clinked glasses, and Eleanor felt the warmth of being truly seen and valued by people who knew her whole story, the parts that made her proud and the parts that made her human. After dinner, as they moved to the living room for coffee, Eleanor's phone rang. The display showed the familiar number of the federal prison where Marcus was serving his sentence. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, stepping onto the back porch for privacy. "Mom?" Marcus's voice came through clearly, though she could hear the institutional sounds of the prison in the background. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" "I'm good, really good. I finished the curriculum for the financial literacy program, and the warden wants to expand it to include family reconciliation workshops. He thinks what we're doing, the way we're rebuilding our relationship, might help other families." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "That sounds wonderful, Marcus." "Mom, I need to tell you something. I've been meeting with a family who's in a situation similar to what I put you through. Their son stole their retirement money for a gambling addiction, and they don't know how to move forward. I've been sharing our letters, the way you've been willing to forgive without forgetting, how you've set boundaries while keeping the door open. And how is that helping them? The mother said something yesterday that made me think of you. She said, 'I don't know how to stop loving him, but I don't know how to trust him either.' And I realized that's exactly what you've been navigating with me, learning to love someone while staying safe from them." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his insight. "That's exactly right. I'm learning that love and trust are different things, Mom. You can choose to love someone while they're earning back your trust. It doesn't make you weak or naive, it makes you wise." "When did you become so wise?" Eleanor asked, smiling through her tears. "I had a good teacher. Actually, several good teachers. You, my therapist, the families I'm working with here. Pain is a pretty effective educator when you stop running from it." They talked for a few more minutes about practical things. Books he was reading, programs he was enrolled in, his plans for when he was released in 4 years. But underneath the logistics was something neither of them mentioned directly: the growing foundation of a relationship built on truth rather than fantasy, on accountability rather than excuses. When Eleanor returned to the living room, her friends looked at her expectantly. "Good call," David asked. "Very good call." Eleanor settled back into her chair, feeling the warmth of the fire David had built in her fireplace. He's helping other families navigate similar situations. The boy who used to manipulate people is learning to heal them instead. "That's not accident," Sophia observed. "Hurt people either hurt other people or heal other people. He's choosing healing." "We all are," Eleanor said, looking around at the faces of people who'd become family through choice rather than biology. "That's what tonight is really about, celebrating the choice to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy." As her friends prepared to leave, Eleanor stood in her doorway watching them go. Maggie, who'd stood by her through the worst of everything. Sophia, who'd risked her career to tell the truth. David, who'd fought for justice and stayed for love. Each of them had taught her something different about resilience, courage, and the power of choosing compassion over bitterness. Later that evening, Eleanor sat in her study, working on the memoir she'd decided to write. Not a sensational tell-all, but a thoughtful exploration of how families heal from betrayal, how forgiveness works in real life rather than theory, how people can lose everything and discover they still have enough to build a meaningful life. The manuscript was titled Starting Over, A Guide to Rebuilding After Betrayal, and it would be published by a small press that specialized in healing narratives. Eleanor had no illusions about literary fame, but she hoped her story might help other families navigate similar crises with more support and fewer mistakes than she'd had. On her desk, in a small frame beside her computer, sat Marcus's childhood finger painting, the lopsided house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. The paper was faded now, edges worn from handling, but the hope it represented had proven remarkably durable. In 4 years, Marcus would be released from prison. Eleanor didn't know what their relationship would look like then, what kind of man he'd become, or whether the healing they'd started would prove strong enough to withstand the test of daily life together. But she knew something now that she hadn't known 15 years ago. Love didn't require certainty, only courage. The boy who'd painted their family had grown into a man who'd nearly destroyed it. But sometimes Eleanor was learning destruction was just the first step toward rebuilding something better, something real, something worth the long, careful work of choosing love over fear. Day after difficult day. Outside her window, the Pacific stretched toward a horizon she couldn't see, vast and mysterious and full of possibilities. Eleanor turned back to her manuscript, adding one final sentence to the chapter she'd been writing. The end of one story is always the beginning of another. The only question is what kind of story you choose to write next. She saved the document, turned off her computer, and went to bed in her own house, in her own life, surrounded by people who knew her worth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose healing over harm, new chances to build something beautiful from whatever remained. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor Blackwood was exactly where she belonged, and tomorrow she would continue becoming exactly who she was meant to be. The story was far from over, but finally she was the one writing it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,